Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible until it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here are your hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back. This is Joe Cirincione. Michelle Dover is traveling this week, so you're stuck with me. She's at Wilton Park in London and then in San Francisco. And this is not our last podcast of the year. We have a special podcast for you next week. I hope you'll listen in. It's just Michelle and I looking back over the nuclear decade in review. What went right? What went wrong? What are the lessons we learned? What does it look like going into 2020? But today, we have a fabulous interview with Ambassador Susan Burk, who served in the Obama administration as the president's special representative on nuclear non-proliferation. She has been representing the United States at the review conferences for the Non-Proliferation Treaty for decades. She helps us look back on the last 25 years of the treaty, its future, can it survive? And she shares some of our ideas for creating a world without nuclear weapons. Before that, we're pleased to be joined by Allegra Harpootlian of Rethink Media and Akshai Vikram, a Roger Hale Fellow here at Plowshares Fund. We look at the crises developing in South Asia and the costs of the endless wars we insist on waging in the Middle East. If you like what you hear, we hope you'll rate, comment, subscribe, and share this podcast. Help us grow. Help us reach new audiences. There's a lot to cover, and the clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Welcome to the last edition of Early Warning for 2019 and for the decade. I'm Joe Cirincione, filling in for Michelle Dover, who is at a conference in merry old England, not so merry these days. But I'm here with Akshai Vikram from Plowshares Fund, our Roger Hale Fellow, and Allegra Harpootlian of Rethink Media. We're going to discuss the developing crisis in South Asia and the costs of war in the Middle East. Allegra, I'm going to start with you because you just wrote this excellent piece in the new blog, Responsible Statecraft, put out by the Quincy Institute called Maybe It's Time to Say Okay Boomer to Our Foreign Policy. We'll get to the boomer part, but let's start with the costs. What kind of cost have the people of the region and the people of America had to bear from these endless wars?
Well, there's the financial cost, which is massive. The Brown University Cost of War Project recently said that it's going to be about $6.4 trillion by the end of 2020. But the financial cost, as ginormous as it is really only part of that story. We talk about environmental cost, and that's about the greenhouse gas emissions that the war on terror has emitted has been about the size of Sweden's entire greenhouse gas emissions.
We never think about that.
Right? I think it's one of those visualizations that really work. But also, that's just the environmental cost, the financial cost. Then you look at the human cost. Not only have we lost thousands of our own soldiers and our own blood and treasure, but the cost to the people of the Middle East and South Asia and North Africa, because we're fighting in all of those regions now, has been incredibly high.
Right. Hundreds of thousands killed.
Hundreds of thousands.
Perhaps a million wounded and millions more displaced by these wars.
Exactly. When Brown University tried to calculate the indirect human cost of the war, it was actually almost triple the number they had come up with, which was already almost nearing about 1 million people.
Yeah. And how our concern about these wars has changed over the last 10 years, and even in the last few years. You talk about this in your article. Let us...
Yeah, in the last decade, we really saw a First, we saw an apathy of the American people for our wars. It had already been about 10 years when Obama was coming into office. He had ran on an anti-war platform. And unfortunately, he didn't get the job done. After 18 years of war, people are first fed up and have the inability to figure out how to change something. But now we're really seeing that change. We're really seeing a renewed interest in both ending the wars and in really questioning American foreign policy writ large.
Why are you there in the first place? But what's fueling this change?
I think one of the biggest things that's fueling it is the renewed activism we're seeing in young people. From climate change to gun control, we have seen young people push back on the idea that nothing can change. And they're starting to come to that conclusion when it comes to U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. role in the world, too. Whether it's on things like ending the wars, which they are supportive of, or things like war on terror policies about Guantanamo and the Muslim ban and different counterterrorism options. They don't believe it works.
Right. They're challenging the very notion of American primacy that has long been common wisdom in this town and, frankly, in my generation. It's about time. Thank you, Allegra. We're going to turn to South Asia now. Akshai, Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India has just passed a sweeping new citizenship bill that people fear will defranchise the Muslim citizens of India. Some 200 million Muslims live in India. And there have been massive protests about this spread and a crackdown by the government against the protests. That's disturbing in and of itself, but it also has serious ramifications for India's continued occupation and siege of Kashmir, a struggle that many fear could lead to another war on the subcontinent. What's going on?
I think from the beginning of India's history as a modern state, it has been proud of the fact that it has been a secular democracy, a multi-ethnic state. And I think that identity has been really challenged by Narendra Modi's actions in 2019. What we're seeing in Kashmir and across India is both Narendra Modi and the BJP pushing against that identity of India as whether it's going to be a secular state or whether it's going to be a home for the Hindu people, or whether there's going to be backlash to that idea. And I think whether or not we have a peaceful 2020 in India-Pakistan relations and in Kashmir specifically is going to depend a lot on how the protests in India manifest themselves over the coming weeks.
We're seeing the government apply some of the techniques it's used in Kashmir now on India as a whole, shutting off the internet, fierce police suppression of peaceful demonstrations, mass arrests. Where do we stand with Kashmir? It's been months now since Indian troops moved in and locked down that entire state. Where is the struggle now, and where might it lead?
So I think what we've seen is that when they come for the human rights of Kashmiris, they eventually come for the human rights of all Indians. A lot of the tactics that the Indian government was pioneering in Kashmir have now been implemented across India in different capacities. And I think this shows what happens when you persecute a minority, that those persecutions can eventually lead to the rest of the population. No one is really safe from these types of actions. Where it could lead has a lot of really dangerous and ominous answers. I think we've seen a lot of pretty nefarious steps on the Indian government recently that inspire a lot of fear. India's been walking back its no first use nuclear policy, which means that India used to be a country that said that we will never use nuclear weapons first. That no longer seems to be true. It's definitely not reliable anymore. Narendra Modi also provoked Pakistan shortly before his election campaign in earlier this year to apparent electoral success. And he also instituted this new Muslim law right when India was encountering a lot of economic difficulty. So this could be the beginning of a dangerous trend of leaders using their nuclear weapons to distract from other problems that they're facing, which could be particularly troubling in 2020. I would also add that this means that we could be dealing with a different India from the point of view of the United States than the one that we were counting on. An India that was a multi-ethnic democracy, that would be balanced to China, that we have common linguistic ties with, common cultural and historical ties with, is a very different proposition than an ethno-nationalist Hindu majority state that is proud of its Hindu identity and only its Hindu identity. That may still be a strategic partner against China, but it's a very different type of strategic partner, and we have to ask ourselves how that's going to change U.S. policy. And finally, very briefly, I think what's been most glaringly obvious is the absence of the United States in any sort of resolution to the conflict in Kashmir and conflicts in between India and Pakistan. There's been some attempt on the Hill to reach into this issue, but if you look at how previous administrations pursued this with diplomatic persistence, it is patently obvious that this administration does not have the attention span to handle this.
Excellent. Allegra, Akshai, thank you very much. We're going to pursue both these topics in the new year with in-depth interviews with members of Congress who are trying to address both of these. Thank you for helping us close out this year and this decade.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
Welcome back to one of my favorite segments on this podcast where I ask Joe questions he has not seen.
I'm in a glass enclosed soundproof booth no, just kidding. We're not at the Department of Interior. We're here at the Plowshares Fund headquarters, but I'm ready for your question. Who's asking?
So today's question comes from a Twitter follower of ours named Orion.
Like the constellation?
Like the constellation.
All right, let's go, Orion.
So Orion has a question for both of us, actually, about how we would classify the nuclear weapon states and most nuclear-inclined latent states.
This is a sophisticated question.
In terms of being nuclear policy takers, makers, or breakers.
Okay, first of all, Orion, you should come on the show. Wow, and you can tell us what you mean by that. We think this. Okay, let's find out. How do we classify them? So the nuclear weapon states. Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, this is complicated. Let's see if we can go through this. Let's just start with, obviously everybody's favorite villainous nuclear weapon state is North Korea.
Yep.
They're the most recent, detonated in 2006. Mm-hmm. They have enough material for somewhere around 20 or 30 weapons. They're the new nuclear kids.
The new nuclear kids. I like that.
Clearly a breaker.
Yeah.
Clearly a breaker, no question about it. The other problematic nuclear weapon states that are outside any of the control regimes are Israel, who got a weapon around 1968, and then India and Pakistan, who got weapons first tested in 1998. These are breakers. Yeah, I think there's no question about it. And I say that because we sometimes give them a pass. But each one of these three states cheated, lied on the agreements that they had with the nuclear supplier states to give them equipment, reactors, for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Mm-hmm. They promised that they would not use any of that material, that energy, those resources for weapons purposes. Each one of them lied. Mm-hmm. Each one of them, each three of those programs was born in sin. Right? So there's no pass here. They weren't good guys that got their weapons legitimately. They all lied about how they were doing this. And in Pakistan's case, not only did they cheat to get the bomb, they then put it in reverse. So I put Pakistan as the worst of the offenders here. And under A.Q. Khan, it proliferated madly, sending centrifuges and technology and even bomb designs to Libya, mm-hmm. to Iran, to a yet unidentified third country. The IAEA knows but doesn't release it. So clearly all three of these are breakers. So then you have the certified, so to speak, nuclear weapon states, the five who are recognized as the permanent members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the P5. You could say they all got their weapons legally. There were no control regimes at the time. So in order, obviously the United States, 1945, then the Soviet Union, 49, United Kingdom, 1950, France, 1960, China, 64. Are you impressed, Michelle?
I am impressed. I'm taking notes right here.
Yeah. Well, I'm not using notes. And, you'd have to say that all of these are in general makers. I mean, the United States and the Soviet Union, with the other countries of the world, made the Non-Proliferation Treaty, created the IAEA, created the kind of guardrails that we now have. Strong or weak, at least they were all trying. And then eventually the others came around. United Kingdom first, France, China. I mean, here's a good example. We think of China as an adversary, but on non-proliferation, they follow the rules of the road. there are not major violations. They are not exporting their material. They're not contributing currently to proliferation. Mao once thought that the former leader of China, for those who don't remember who Mao Zedong is, that proliferation was good, that all countries should get nuclear weapons. This was the great equalizer. And then after India got the bomb, he started to rethink that strategy. Maybe that wasn't such a good idea, and they became neutral. And then they became an enthusiastic a participant in the non-proliferation regime. So I would say those were makers. Whew, do we really want to go into latent states?
I know. The list I had that came to mind included Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, Japan, South Korea. I mean, it's kind of an interesting mix, right? Some of those states are, as you say, enthusiastic participants in the non-proliferation regime, although there are questions that arise about whether or not and under what conditions they might pursue a bomb.
Well, let's just pause here to recognize the success of the regimes we built with others, mainly the U.S. and the League, but others. When John F. Kennedy famously warned in 1960 that if we didn't do something, there'd be 15, 20, 25 nations with nuclear weapons, he wasn't talking about our adversaries. He had seen the intelligence reports. The first non-proliferation NIE, or intelligence assessment, was done in 58, 59 under Eisenhower. And they identified states that were on the verge, that were starting to move towards program. And most of these were our allies, right? Japan. Germany. So remember, Kennedy's saying this in 1960. It's 15 years after the war that defeated Japan and Germany, and both of those countries are talking about getting nuclear weapons. It was Sweden. It was Norway. It was Switzerland, Australia. All kinds of countries were thinking, these are the cool new weapons. We all should get them, right? Well, we built a regime that stopped that. Now, and we stopped it in its tracks. We rolled it back. There's a reason they didn't get that. A large part of the NPT, its security assurances, alliance relationships. We convinced our allies not to get it. The Soviet Union imposed it on their allies, and it's held for 50 years. 50 years this regime has held. We are going to get into this in detail with our guest this week, Ambassador Susan Burk, who's been working these issues for a good 25 years, so half the life of the treaty, she's been working on this. So where we are today is when you talk about latency, you have to look at any country that has nuclear energy has the potential to turn that civilian program into weapons use. They have an industrial base, they have the engineering. In some cases, with the kinds of reactors they have, they could quickly go and make the material. So we're talking about, I don't know, what do you think, Michelle? Maybe 25 or so countries that could quickly turn to nuclear weapons. Top of the pack, you got to say it's Japan. Why? Because they have this boondoggle of a plutonium separation program that has produced thousands of tons of plutonium that could be quickly converted to the core of a bomb. In fact, I estimate that if Japan wanted to, they could probably build a bomb within 6 months.
The margin of error of what gets stuck in the pipes at that facility is the amount that would be required to make a bomb.
Yeah.
So the margin of error is something that they could just turn into.
Yeah. So the latent countries that you're most worried about, well, I would say Japan, because it has the material, it has the capability, and somewhat because of North Korea or China, the incentive to do this. South Korea wouldn't be far behind. They don't have the material yet, but they could quickly acquire it from the what do they have? About 50 nuclear reactors in their country. They could turn some of those reactors into plutonium production pipelines. So you're worried about those countries. So what the pullback from this, the big lesson is, there's no secret to nuclear weapons. This is 75-year-old technology. There's no shortage of capability among nations. This is a political decision on the part of these nations not to acquire them. And we have to do all we can to make sure that their strategic calculations, their political calculations, keep going in the direction they have been going. That is, they're more safe, they're more secure without nuclear weapons than they are with them.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Michelle. It's my pleasure to be here in a rainy, grim afternoon in late December with Ambassador Susan Burk, who has had a 35-year experience of working non-proliferation issues with the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, with the State Department. She was appointed to the rank of ambassador to represent the United States to the Conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was in when, Susan? 2010?
2010.
2010. And you and I first met at the 1995 Review and Extension Conference.
We did. We had lunch.
We had lunch at the UN.
Yeah.
That was what was wonderful. So it was that was a very significant conference because it was deciding the fate of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Should it be renewed and extended for beyond its original 25-year duration, and it was. Now it's a permanent treaty. But why don't you tell some of the people who might not know what the treaty is? What is this NPT?
Well, I have to make it very simple. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons was negotiated in the mid to late 60s. It was the lead negotiators were the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, United Kingdom, and the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. And it was the first effort to address the issue of non-proliferation or preventing the further spread of nuclear weapons on a global level. And so this treaty established a vehicle for all states all over the world to forswear nuclear weapons. And it committed the 5 states who possessed nuclear weapons at the time, known as the P5, the United States, United Kingdom, then Soviet Union, now Russia, France, and China. It committed those states, when they became parties, to pursue good faith negotiations on nuclear disarmament and to halt the nuclear arms race. Just as a footnote, I'd note that just the year before the NPT was concluded in 1968, the Latin American states had concluded a regional nuclear weapon free zone treaty, the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which was...
you're an expert when you can say the Treaty of Tlatelolco.
Which was concluded and signed in Mexico City. But that only provided a non-proliferation vehicle for states in Latin America. So the NPT was a global treaty. Concluded in 1968, entered into force in 1970. At the time that it was signed, I think there were 55 states that had signed on to the treaty. Today, in 2019, on the cusp of 2020, the treaty has nearly universal membership. It's got 190 some states, and there are only 4 states, I believe, that are outside of the treaty at the time. So
you see, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, which left and announced it was
withdrawing from the treaty.
Yeah. So what do you think the state of the treaty regime now? What's your assessment of where we are on the twin bargains of the treaty, nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation?
Well, it's like the State of the Union.
Yeah.
It depends. I think right now the treaty's facing some real challenges. Part of that is that there has traditionally and perennially been deep frustration on the part of the states that don't have nuclear weapons, the non-nuclear weapon states, with the pace of progress that the nuclear weapons possessors are making to pursue nuclear disarmament. Even though nuclear stockpiles have been drastically reduced over the last several decades, it is still, we're not any closer to zero or to the elimination of nuclear weapons. That frustration is always there. It's moderated when the United States in particular and the United States and Russia can point to some specific developments or advances that they've made in nuclear arms control. So I think right now, as we face a situation where at the moment, there are no advances in nuclear arms control. And in fact, what we're seeing is a withdrawal from existing or rolling back of existing arms control agreements.
Right.
The INF Treaty, not going to cast aspersions.
I'll do that.
Discussions. This Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, signed but not enforced because several key states, including the United States, have not ratified it. New START extension should be a no-brainer, but for some reason it's not seen as in that way.
Right. If that treaty goes, that will be the last of the arms control treaties, and it'll be the first time since 1972 that the U.S. and Russia haven't had any limitations whatsoever on their strategic forces.
Exactly.
So that's the prospect. I mean, that looks likely at this point.
Well, it may look likely. Hope springs eternal. If New START is not extended, that is the last formal, verifiable, negotiated arms control agreement, nuclear arms reduction agreement between the U.S. and Russia. I think then the situation looks really grim.
So it was your job to represent the United States to these review conferences. When we met in 95, you were... what were you? What was your position?
Well, I was a division chief in the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and I had been charged with the responsibility for doing all the preparations for the Review and Extension Conference. And
who was the representative of the U.S.
The
at
head
that
of
time?
delegation was Ambassador Thomas Graham.
Oh, yes.
Special representative. I eventually assumed that position in my last job. And
good work.
So
moved him out of the way, took his job. Great.
So I was sort of chief cook and bottle washer and organized the interagency and the international preparations for the U.S. delegation that led to that. So that was a tremendous amount of work.
I'm going to ask you what the prospects are for the 2020 review conference, because these conferences come every 5 years. There's been prep cons leading up to them. But before I ask you that, I'm just curious. Looking back at 1995, I know what your official government position was. You were in favor of the permanent, or what we called indefinite extension of the treaty. I was too. I was leading a coalition of arms control groups out on the outside, working the hallways of the UN, trying to convince governments to do this. Looking back, was it a smart move to get the indefinite extension? Did that relieve the pressure on disarmament? Did the non-nuclear states get a bum rush in that deal?
That is an excellent question. I think it was the right decision because I don't believe that the nuclear weapon states, I think the nuclear weapon states pursue disarmament when they perceive it to be in their interest and when they've achieved, the verification and that sort of thing. It's really only the U.S. and the Russians that we're talking about right now in terms of real nuclear disarmament. I think if the treaty were up for another extension in this climate, I would be very concerned. So I think it was the
right, because here we are 25 years later. This is the 50th anniversary of the treaty. If we had extended it for another 25 years, which was one of the options, we would be facing this question right now, whether the treaty should live or die. And you think?
I think I'm glad that the parties don't have that decision to make. I think we're fortunate they don't have that decision to make. And the symbolism you mentioned, 50 years after entry into force, 25 years since the treaty was made permanent, and 75 years after the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So these review conferences are always politically significant, but the symbolism of this one is kind of over the top. And civil society...
Probably the most important one since 25 years ago.
Right.
And civil society?
Civil society is also very focused on this and very active and engaged, which is a good thing. In 2010, the United States worked very hard with the non-governmental community. We met regularly, we briefed regularly the non-governmental organizations in New York because they have a real stake. That's the constituency, I think, for these issues. And we made it a point of being very available to discuss and to also to hear their views. So I think the non-governmental organization, civil society, is going to also emphasize the symbolism of this conference.
What do you think the prospects are then for this conference, which is going to start in April of 2020? What do you think the mood is out there? Are the non-nuclear weapon states satisfied with the treaty? Are they going to come in with demands? Are the nuclear weapon states going to have a story to tell that is going to convince the other nations to keep supporting the treaty, keep adhering to it?
I'm not so sure about that piece of it, about what the nuclear weapon states can say, but I have been involved in some meetings where I was struck by the fact that there was less pessimism than I would have anticipated. And I think that think it's important for all the parties, and I've certainly made this point when I've had opportunities to do so, to all the parties to understand the stake they have in the treaty. And if the traditional leaders in this are not exercising the same kind of leadership, then it's up to other parties to, take charge, I think, take leadership, offer initiatives, offer proposals, and do what they can so that the review conference ends in a positive way. I mean, we talk about how to define success, but I don't think it's up to one state or a group of states to determine the outcome or the conduct of the conference. It's a treaty that's almost universal. There are lots and lots of countries, and I'd call on other parties to step up to the plate and to play a role, contribute, offer ideas, see what they can do, and avoid the all or nothing kind of outcome that these conferences tend to gravitate towards, because the likelihood of coming up with nothing is high. And I think we're in a situation right now where that is not that's not a desirable outcome.
Yes. It's not clear to me what story the U.S. is going to have to tell. I mean, since the last NPT review conference, the U.S., especially in the last 3 years, has been tearing down the arms control regime. I mean, a conscious strategy. We've talked about this on previous podcasts. John Bolton didn't believe in this structure. He led the way. And not just the official disarmament treaties, limitation treaties, but also the JCPOA, the Iran anti-nuclear deal, one of the non-proliferation milestones of the last 25 years. He's led the United States out of that. So the United States seems to me to be coming in here with the weak hand. The State Department is doing something interesting. They have started a process that they call creating the conditions for nuclear disarmament and gathering countries together, representatives from countries, to talk about how the world would have to change, what the political climate would have to be in order to permit nuclear disarmament. It looks like that's the storyline they're developing for 2020.
Well, it looks like that to me too. I think it's a creative idea. If you have nothing else, but I'm not sure it's enough. And I think the whole idea of looking at the environment, creating conditions, I think that's really valid if you're talking about going to zero. Fundamentally, eliminating nuclear weapons and moving away from that. I think we do need to talk about the conditions. We do need to talk about a world situation
that would allow us to actually get rid of the very last nuclear weapon.
To go down to zero. But I think that this initiative would be more meaningful and more valid or more useful if at the same time the U.S. and Russia in particular were continuing to pursue traditional arms reduction measures.
Yes.
Now, extend New START. Not walk away from everything and say, well, we just can't do anything right now because the conditions aren't right. Well, they were able to do things before. I don't think the conditions have deteriorated so much since then. If I were on the other side, I could argue that maybe the conditions are deteriorating for reasons that don't have anything to do with other parties.
Right. So, Ronald Reagan started the arms reduction process when we actually started cutting weapons in 86, 87 at the height of the Cold War. Right. Conditions couldn't have been worse.
They couldn't have been worse, right. And in 2010, I just remind you, and you may remember this, but the United States gave a briefing in 2010. It was Department of Energy, and they put on a screen, and we had a large group for this side event, put on a screen a chart which looked at stockpile levels for the last 30 or 35 years and showed that over those years, it had been steadily declining.
Absolutely. Since 1987, steady decreases. Now, the arrows have all been pointing down.
Right. And I looked at this and said, oh my gosh, I'm going to get hit up I'm going to be hearing about how you still have 5,900 whatever weapons. I never heard that. I had so many foreign partners come up to me and say, I had no idea that your stockpiles were continuing to be reduced, even at times when the rhetoric was a little bellicose. That was what they took away from this, that this had been a steady pattern. What I see now and what I read and we look at is the likelihood we could be going in the opposite direction.
Right. The reductions have stopped. We have now flatlined in both the U.S. and Russia. There are no more reductions. We're at a sort of steady state, and we might be going up because both countries, in fact, all 9 of the nuclear-armed countries, are all building new nuclear weapons.
Right. So you've got paralysis in the arms control area. You've got the potential to reverse this 35-year decline. This is not good, and it's going to be very hard to, I think, sell the idea that somehow the rest of the world has to figure out how to make the world safe for nuclear disarmament. I think we would be in a much stronger position if we were continuing to do what we could do, hold the line on the agreements that we've made, keep them in force, see if we can expand, participation, and then talk about creating conditions or creating the environment. I think it's valid, but I think it would be much more saleable if we were also not just talking the talk, but also walking the walk.
So therefore, what do you think is going to happen? What do you fear might happen?
Okay. What I fear will happen is, because I've participated in 3 of these review conferences now, 85, 95, and 2010, all of which, just by the way, produced some sort of consensus report. So
that's the mark of success.
Well,
the treaties succeed, the meeting has succeeded if you achieve a consensus report.
If you produce some sort of agreement. I think now, just statistically, if you look at the number of parties, the number of agendas, the number of issues, the likelihood of getting agreement on a single document with everybody on board is slim to none. My advice, if anyone were asking for it, which they're not,
I'm asking for your advice.
My advice to other parties would be recognize that a massive final document is just not in the cards, and it's not a failure if you can't do it. But that they ought to be focusing on teasing out the areas of common ground, and there will be some. Tease out the areas of common ground. See if you can agree on some statement. Maybe it's a page. Maybe it's 2 paragraphs. And then see what else you can report that says there are all these other issues that we don't agree on, but we think they're important. And we think that the states parties to the NPT should continue to discuss these, should continue to work on them, should continue to pursue solutions to them. Most importantly, the parties need to, as they've done every review conference in the past, they need to once again reaffirm upfront their continued strong support for this treaty as indispensable for their security, for international security, national security, and I would also, if I were king, I would say, and also noting that it's irreplaceable. That if you tried to negotiate an NPT today in its current, with obligations, you couldn't do it. So I would say, hold on to this, recognize that it's not perfect, recognize that progress in some areas is better than others, build on it, but don't throw it away.
Excellent. Let me ask you some personal questions, if you don't mind. How did you get started in this field? What convinced you? Did you start off thinking you were going to devote the rest of your life to nuclear nonproliferation?
No, actually, I did not. I was working in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and I had.
When was this?
I don't even want to give that away. But
it was in the
it was a long time ago.
Time. Okay.
Let's just say that I actually participated in the first UN Special Session on Disarmament in 1978.
Okay.
Yeah, I was very young, and I was only up there for a week. But I did multilateral arms control, and then I was asked to move to the Theater Nuclear Forces Policy Office to do INF.
Oh, yes.
And I discovered that not only did I not have an aptitude for that, I really didn't enjoy it. And I had someone tell me about a job at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in the Non-Proliferation Bureau, working for Dr. Lewis Dunn.
Yes.
And I applied, and my life changed. And I discovered
Lewis Dunn, still active in the field.
I know. And I discovered a field which I had always thought was really important. I used to think that the likelihood of a nuclear use was probably greater in a proliferation sense than in necessarily a cold, a U.S. Soviet. And I discovered a field that I enjoyed immensely and had tremendous passion for. And I was able to spend the vast majority of my career working on these issues, doing all sorts of things. So that's how I got involved.
And looking back, you happy with that career choice?
I'm very happy. I had a great career. I have no regrets. No.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I don't mean to sort of end this on a pessimistic note, but I was wondering what your fears are, what you worry about on the non-proliferation side. If the disarmament side of this bargain continues to stall, what could happen?
Well, I think the thing people who've been in the field like me think about is what happens if the treaty were to collapse. If you had a number of states decide to withdraw or to defect. I hesitate to even say this in this setting, but right now we have a number of nuclear weapons free zone treaties that have been concluded, and they cover large portions of the world.
All of South America, nuclear free. All of Africa, nuclear free.
South Pacific, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. Now, not all of them are in the same state, and the U.S. has not signed the protocol.
And this is because some people say the NPT is a collection of regional non-proliferation pacts, and that's because these countries decide that they are better off if they and their neighbors do not have nuclear weapons. So that's the sort of the core security decision they make.
Exactly.
It's not fundamentally about nuclear disarmament up in the superpowers. It's about what's going on in their neighborhood.
What's going on in their neighborhood. So you've got this complex of these nuclear weapon free zone treaties that have been set up, and they obligate the states, the regional states parties, not to acquire nuclear weapons, and they provide for IEA safeguards for verification. And some of them have more robust enforcement and compliance provisions as well that the NPT didn't have. And I think we've learned a lot since the NPT was negotiated about the issues of compliance and enforcement and that sort of thing. Could a state decide, I'm a party to a nuclear weapons free zone treaty, I'm not going to proliferate, but I'm not going to be part of this? That's one potential risk. And the other one is we've now got the Treaty on the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, the ban treaty.
Yes.
And I would just have to say, and I'm a little biased, none of these are a replacement for the NPT because, again, the NPT currently binds the P5 to pursue nuclear disarmament. Now, it doesn't capture India and Pakistan. It doesn't capture Israel. North Korea's announced it was withdrawing. But it does capture the big states with a legally binding obligation. If the treaty were to collapse, you still don't have those states.
Yes.
So I don't see how it fixes the problem. And I don't see how doing that would compel the U.S. or the Russians or anything or others to take steps that they felt weren't in their security interest at the time.
Well, the ban treaty proponents see this as an addition to the NPT, not a replacement for it.
Depends on who you talk to. I think I've read. I think that's true, but I also know that there are others. I've read other pieces here where there's some supporters of the ban treaty who think that it would be a substitute. I think it's deficient in a lot of ways. I won't go into that, but I do. It's important to remember that you do have an instrument that's been in place for a long time.
Yes.
That captures the big five, and trying to come up with something that would do that again today, I would not bet on it. And I think we need to hold on to what we have. We need to work on it. We need to improve it. We need to build on it. And we need to try to do what we can do to encourage the U.S. and the Russians to move ahead on nuclear disarmament. And this is where the parties, if they keep faith with the NPT, I think are in a better position to urge these states to do something. I don't know how long it will take. I don't know whether it'll be successful, but I think that's where we are.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Susan. And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you back after the NPT review conference, and we can take stock of what happened.
That would be a lot of fun.
Great.
I think.
Thanks for coming in.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.